Session 2, Strategies, poses the question, how do we see the past and the existing, and of what is at stake, what will be changed in projects of alteration, as well as grasping the specificity of the physical object, i.e., what is there physically on the ground. In alteration projects, it is crucial to map the forces of cultural expectation present in the various representations and mediations of the existing, to record both the building as a physical fact and as a cultural artifact constructed over time. That's what we said before we started. I thought I'm going to say a few words now. I'm actually even going to show 3 pictures now at the start, just to kind of continue the discussion from yesterday, perhaps. One thing we also wrote in the general introduction was, how can the ambition in alteration design be raised? And I think when we wrote that, we were interested perhaps in issues around projects which perhaps might frequently be kind of constructed as a kind of minor activity or a not very important activity, and trying to say, well, how might altering something be seen as a really extremely important design activity? And in answering that, for me, there's a whole question about valuing, basically. And I think what we're going to do today, and I think continue to do tomorrow, we're going to have some discussions about how you value things. And partly that's discussion is about how you value what is there. So in terms of being able to see what's there, I would say that's to do with the kind of filters you put in place when you look. And those filters are kind of de facto a system for valuing. Certain things are considered to be important and are therefore recorded and seen. Other things aren't. But at the same time, I don't think we can escape the fact that the discussion is always going to be about how do you value your own activities as a profession. There are certain sorts of activity which you might have to value much more if you're going to be able to engage in another way. One could say there are certain kinds of activity you need to value more if you are going to be able to do the kind of seeing that might be necessary. So I think it's okay to keep in mind an idea about, I think this will come up in all the papers, I hope, but I think this will come up in all the papers, that there's an issue about valuing, both in terms of seeing what is there and in terms of understanding how you act and valuing particular kinds of action. And in both those things, for me, and now I'm talking a kind of personal position, I suppose, in terms of my way into the discussion, is that because you're architects in the room, there is a very specific question about representation. And we don't need to go into all of this. But obviously, architects, that's kind of what you do. You just represent continuously, on and on and on and on. And it's not that you always do nice little drawings, but you'll find yourself talking at meetings, you represent in the same way that a politician will represent, that you argue for things. And so if the seeing that you do is to become effective, i.e. is if you are going to be able to persuade people with it, it almost inevitably leads to an action of representation, that you go from that seeing to a notation of it. Okay? And at the same time, I think, once you start to question or review the kind of activities that are valued, there is also baked into that some kind of question of representation. Now I'm going to be very naughty. How many minutes do I have? Can't see much. I've had 5 minutes. I'm going to talk 5 minutes more. I'm going to be very naughty and show 3 pictures, right, which I'm not really allowed to do because I'm not one of the speakers, but you'll have to bear with me. So, and these pictures are supposed to be about what I've just said, about seeing what is there and about the issue of revaluing what kind of activities are really important to be able to undertake as an architect. This picture, I know, I assume nearly all of you have seen before. It's pretty much my favorite picture. And just as a byword, this issue about representation takes place within systems. And so any system of representation has its own inbuilt syntax over what it is easy to represent and not. And you will always engage that whenever you try and change what you show in a representation. Yesterday you saw a picture of an obelisk. This is the drawing of the project to move the obelisk from the side of St. Peter's Church in Rome to the front of St. Peter's Church in Rome. And it's a drawing that took, well, it's a drawing from a book that took 3 years to produce, right? This is 3 years of work for somebody to produce the drawings. And the book is called Della Trasformazione dell'Obelisco Vaticano, about moving the Vatican obelisk. And the author of the book is claiming that he is a very big guy architect, basically on the back of having moved one piece of stone that weighed a lot, 250 meters. That is what he did. His action was to move a piece of stone about a bit. But what it seems to me is valuable about this case in history, so the author is Domenico Fontana. The drawing was made between 1587, when he'd finished moving it. He made the drawing afterwards, not before. Or a lot of other people made the drawing. It was made between 1587 and 1590. What's interesting, I think, is a number of things. The first is that it's created within a system of representation which is really made for representing permanent buildings, because that's what architects were measured by. So it's based on a plan which shows you the plan of an urban space. But what is very interesting about it is that into that system of representation has been added a lot of other things that usually remain invisible, or at that stage remained invisible, in architects' systems of representing what was important. And so you can see in this drawing that the space in the drawing, the right-hand side of the drawing is the edge of the Church of St. Peter. On the left and the bottom, you see the walls of the buildings that were surrounding the space. The space is full of strange-looking squiggles, which almost could have been produced by a Peter Cook or a Cedric Price, I say. As you look, you understand those squiggles relate to a little inset scene at the bottom, which is all about things that move, right? So this drawing is suddenly all about all the things that have to move in order that this piece of work will be done. Intriguingly, the drawing actually has real problems to do this. It has to cheat and change orders of representation. So certain things have to disappear in order for it to work. I'm just going to take you through the details, and they're very beautiful. So this is what it's all about, things that just move. Horses, men that go home at the end of the day. That's then translated into an image about, which is basically 2 circles, which represents the same thing in diagram form within the plan. As you move into the plan, you meet the plan of an extraordinary construction, those little squares, timber poles around a bigger square, that's the obelisk. And as you move into that, the lines that are showing the wires or the ropes that pull have to disappear from the representation suddenly. And they kind of disappear at the point you get to an object which is a bit more permanent. So these ropes are very temporary, they move, and the horses move. But suddenly it gets to this plan, and the ropes disappear, but the pulleys remain. And as you go on into the plan, you get the object that is to be moved, the obelisk itself, represented in another, and I'm not going to go into it, but there's another very interesting flip in the representational system, which is about which direction you're looking from. And all in all, the other thing this drawing does, which I think is phenomenal, is it within a kind of code of representation that was already thinking that drawing a city meant drawing buildings and spaces. It kind of tells you, well, my idea about the city, and again, this could almost be a kind of super studio image. There is no city, right? There's a horizon and an empty space. And within that space, there are these extraordinary activities that allow something to happen. So it seems to me that this is an amazing example in the history of architecture of an architect trying to argue for another set of what is there through a representation. It also seems to me that it shows some of the problems of doing that, but it also, if you look at the history around it, this is the last image of the obelisk in its cage being lowered. It also caused huge problems for this architect in the history of architecture. He's not a popular guy. The history of architecture is notable for its complete dismissive remarks about Domenico Fontana. And the remarks are based on the quality of the physical objects he produced. And what I think there is interesting is that to do the revaluing of activities, Domenico Fontana very much is saying, you know, moving this object was a pretty big deal, and I ought to get some credit for that. That was an argument that remained very hard to maintain within the kind of history of, or the writing of the history of a profession. So I think the revaluing part is hard. I mean, you have to see very hard. You have to think very hard about how you represent what you see. And you have to think very hard to persuade people to revalue how they value your actions. And I think all of these things come out in the question about ways of seeing. I'm very happy to invite the four speakers who are going to talk for today.